Hello and welcome to Tisky Sour. Throughout the Brexit process, British audiences have become pretty familiar with the politics of the DUP. The Democratic Unionist Party are propping up May's government and have been influential by blocking May's deal and opposing her. Backstop more on that later. But the British public have heard much less from Northern Ireland's other major party, Sinn Fein. So tonight on Tisky Sour, I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hazzard, Sinn Fein MP for South Down, who's going to be explaining his party's stance on Brexit. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I'm also delighted to be joined by Dan Finn, Deputy Editor at the New Left Review, who will soon be releasing a book on Northern Irish politics with Verso, One Man's Terrorist, A Political History of the IRA, in the autumn. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Michael.
To get us going, I know it's the question everyone asks you every time you go on TV, but it's how I'm going to start as well. You're an MP, but I know you don't sit in Westminster. Yeah. Explain your abstentionist policy.
Well, Sinn Féin have a proud abstentionist policy. We have always abstained from Westminster, dating right back to Countess Markievicz being elected the first ever woman to Westminster in 1918. But the Irish parliamentarians, the Sinn Féin parliamentarians who won 76 of the 105 seats that year, declared that they would establish the Untittled Dáil, the first Dáil in Dublin instead. And what they established was the first democratic People's Parliament in Irish history, actually. And we have followed that pursuit ever since. We firmly believe that Irish interests cannot be served in a British Parliament, and we have no interest to interfere in British affairs. So we have offices here in London. We engage with the British government, we engage with the opposition, with the media, in the Irish diaspora, which is very important for us as well. However, we do not go in to take the oath and sit in the chamber.
I mean, in this particular Parliament, I mean, obviously I understand that in terms of the principle, but have there been moments where you thought the DUP have had such an impact on British politics, especially in how the Brexit process has gone forward, and have, I suppose, really dominated what people in Britain think of what people in Northern Ireland think about Brexit? Do you know what I mean? So has that been frustrating to see that when people think, how does Northern Ireland relate to Brexit, we think of Arlene Foster?
Well, not so much in that. I think the DUP have been wreckers in this process. I think they've had a fairly toxic relationship with the British government since 2010. Actually, this predates the actual confidence and supply deal, which has not been good for the peace process or for the political institutions in the north, and that's on a range of issues, not just Brexit. But we have no interest. We have very much been on the other side of the table in the Brexit negotiations. We have very much been on the side of the European Parliament and the Irish government in Dublin. So Brexit, as the Irish border and indeed the backstop, these issues of dispute are not created in Ireland. They're not Irish issues of dispute. They've been created by Westminster. So we absolutely don't believe the solution will be found here. So we've exerted our influence and our efforts elsewhere.
So maybe explain sort of the basics. How does Sinn Féin relate to Brexit? What is your policy on it?
We're opposed to Brexit. There is no democratic mandate for Brexit in Ireland whatsoever. We very much view Brexit as in a way that partition would be copper fastened. This would repartition our island economically, socially and community, from a community perspective as well. So we've been very much opposed to Brexit the entire way. Now, the British people voted for Brexit. I wish them well. I really hope it doesn't turn out like I fear it will. However, for the island of Ireland, certainly it represents an existential threat that, again, there's no democratic mandate for. Much like partition, when I referenced the 1918 election, when the people of Ireland overwhelmingly voted for Irish independence in 1918, and they were left in, the British government responded by partitioning our island in two. You fast forward 100 years, there's no democratic mandate for Brexit, and yet we are looking at a hardening of a border and a no-deal Brexit that has been catastrophic for our people.
Dan, I want to bring you in to explain how the Good Friday Agreement relates to Brexit. That's what we hear a lot about in the news, the fact that there are concerns that if a particular kind of Brexit happens, that could contravene the conditions of the Good Friday Agreement. I wonder if you could give us a background as to the issue there.
Well, if you go back to the time when the Good Friday Agreement was negotiated 20 years ago, it does explicitly refer to the two states, the British and Irish states, being members of the EU. But there's also an implicit background assumption that questions of national sovereignty and national identity are becoming less important in the context of European integration, because we're moving towards a more pluralist understanding. people can be both British and Irish. They can take out dual passports, dual nationality, and so on. And it doesn't really matter as much as it did in the past, because in any case, we're all part of the EU. People can live and work in Dublin or in Belfast or in London or in Glasgow. And it's not going to particularly matter which national flag they happen to be under at any given time. Now, it's not just Brexit, and it's not just the north of Ireland which has brought that into question, because we've seen all over Europe, places like Scotland, places like Catalonia, the rise of anti-immigrant right-wing xenophobic parties, various forms of nationalism and the national question coming to the fore. So I think that idea that European integration had made national sovereignty and nation states redundant isn't holding up too well. But in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, what really poses a challenge, it's not so much the technical question of what is on the border or the particular trade relationship with the single market or anything like that. It's what it symbolises, that for nationalists, what Brexit appears to symbolise is growing divergence between the two parts of Ireland, as opposed to convergence, which was what they were hoping for before. And over the last couple of decades, it's been easier for people from a nationalist or a Republican background to reconcile themselves to being under British rule for the time being, for an indefinite period of time, because British nationalism, as coming from the centre, from the government at Westminster, was less in your face. I mean, Tony Blair was still a British nationalist, there's no question about that, but at the time of the peace process, his version of British nationalism on the home front was softer than someone like Thatcher, for example. It was less assertive. It was in the context of a reorganisation of the UK as a whole, not just for Northern Ireland, but also devolution for Scotland and for Wales. And so it appeared that the UK was moving towards a more pluralist understanding of what it meant to be British, and that you could be Scottish and British or Welsh and British, or you could be living in Northern Ireland and not consider yourself to be British at all. And it was legitimate to have the aspiration to want a united Ireland. And, that was something that was quite important for people from a nationalist background. Now, what people see, I think, since 2016 is the resurgence at the centre in Westminster, represented by the Tory party, of the version of British nationalism that they might associate with the more unreconstructed elements in the DUP or the Orange Order, waving the flag, banging your fist on the table, talking about national identity and national sovereignty as an either-or question rather than a both-and question. I think that's where Brexit has really raised questions about the Good Friday Agreement. So when people talk about what regime is going to be introduced for the border, as if this might lead to a resurgence of violence, I think that point is exaggerated, because the argument is that the dissident Republican groups that still want to restart the armed struggle against British rule, that they would attack customs posts on the border, and then you would have a reinforced security presence and there'd be an escalating cycle of violence. I don't think that's as much an issue as some people might suggest, because the main problem for the dissident Republican groups is not a lack of targets. There's still plenty of police officers and prison officers in the north that they could try to kill at any given time, and to some extent they've been successful in attacking people. What undermines them above all is their lack of popular support. They're isolated from nationalist communities. They don't have the kind of popular support that did exist for the IRA in working class, particularly working class nationalist communities during the 1970s and the 1980s. The conditions that made it possible for the IRA to launch an armed campaign at the level of intensity that it managed all through the 1970s and the 80s and into the early 90s, that required a very particular set of circumstances, both long-term and short-term. And right now those conditions don't exist, and it's difficult in the short term anyway to see them coming together in that way. So I don't think there's this inexorable cycle where it leads towards a resurgence of violence, but certainly it leads towards people from a nationalist background, including people who would not be militant nationalists by any means, people who are soft nationalists, let's say, who would like a united Ireland, but it's not their overriding priority at any given time, and they're perfectly happy to stay in the UK for the time being, as long as it's not too disruptive of their lives. But what Brexit, in the particular form that is being called for by Theresa May and by the more extreme Brexiteers in the Tory party, it comes with, number one, this idea of recharged, assertive British nationalism, and also the idea of economic disruption.
So I suppose there's two big issues there sort of relating to the Good Friday Agreement, which is, one is the biggest problem with Brexit symbolic as opposed to sort of like the practical implications of for example, the border,
Yeah.
and the other, are you worried about how a particular kind of Brexit could lead to a resurgence of violence?
Well, I suppose, when the threat to the Good Friday Agreement to it is both symbolic and very much real. If you take citizenship rights, and as Dan's alluded to there, part of the Good Friday Agreement was that people born on the island of Ireland, north and south, could identify as Irish, British, or both. However, we've had a rolling back of that principle over the last number of years, and I already mentioned the fact that since 2010 there has been that toxic relationship between the Conservative Party and the DUP, where we have now the Home Office here in London actually denying people their Irish identity and saying, no, you are dual nationality, you are British identity. And when people are now at the minute in the courts fighting the British government, we had a woman with us today meeting the Foreign Press Association, Emma D'Souza, and she's outlining her case where she says, I am entitled under the Good Friday Agreement to Irish nationality, I am an Irish citizen, and the British government saying, you're not, you're a British citizen until you pay your money to the state to renounce your citizenship. She's waiving the Good Friday Agreement, and the British government are taking her to court to say no, domestic law trumps the internationally binding Good Friday Agreement, and that's a serious issue. I
didn't know that. So in the Good Friday Agreement, it promises people in Northern Ireland the option of having dual nationality,
or Irish identity, or British identity.
And now the British government is saying dual nationality is impossible. You have to be one or the other.
No, they're saying no matter what you think, you're a British resident. You may also have an Irish passport, but you're a British citizen. You are a British citizen no matter what. And there are people saying no, the Good Friday Agreement, and that's an international agreement bound with the United Nations, and that trumps domestic law, certainly in our opinion. And so it's just one example where this is starting then to roll back. So if you take then the whole raft of rights and entitlements as European citizens, therefore, so all our democratic rights are going to be lost whenever we come out of Europe. So despite the fact that I'm an EU citizen, them rights are tied to residency. So we are not living in an EU member state. So we're going to lose democratic rights. We're going to lose our access to the European health card, all the different type of benefits we now, even access to EU student support, different things like that. That's now going to be one of the big things that we've been contacted of late. There are a number of chartered institutions for, say, accountants, for building surveyors, are done on an All-Ireland basis. This is just a practical example. Are done on an All-Ireland basis at home. They have now been written to this week to explain any experience, any work experience, anything you do in the north will now not be considered as part. So that is now going to change the entire face of how your accountants go about being trained, how building surveyors go about trained. And again, that's the chill factor. That's some of the real examples. As far as the violence, I think it's an unknown quantity. We've had the head of the PSNI, the local police service, certainly talk about it. He has expressed anxiety about it. There's no doubt that custom posts would be entirely unwanted and unwarranted. I actually think you would see mass peaceful demonstrations, much like the civil rights protests again of the late 1960s and early 70s. I think you would see tens of thousands of people protesting on the streets against the likes of that. That would have passive civil disobedience, and non-compliance would probably be a far bigger issue. I can imagine that nobody would be showing their passport at the border, or very often the haulage and freight. I can't imagine that industry would be compliant with an awful lot of the rules and regulations that look likely to come in. We know already, for example, that just this week the British government are asking the haulage industry to apply for licences, and there's one particular haulage industry that would do an awful lot of haulage to Britain and to the continent, applied for 1,000 licences. He was awarded 2. So I don't need to spell out what that means for the local manufacturing industry if they're not being able to move their goods and services. So it's a huge problem.
And do you have a position on the various kinds of Brexit on option? I know in principle you oppose it. You want to stay in the EU and you want to be part of a united Ireland. But in terms of May's deal, the backstop, for example, a hard Brexit, do you have a position as a party on these different options?
We're opposed in entirety to Brexit. There is no good Brexit for Ireland. It's only degrees of pain. So what we have at the table with the withdrawal agreement and the backstop is the least worst option. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we've alluded to the backstop, we'll obviously talk to it in more detail, but here we have a protocol that will protect the free movement of goods, but it doesn't protect services or people. It doesn't protect. So it's good for the customs union, but there's serious gaps with the single market, obviously, for the movement of people and movement of services that is still going to have massive problems. So it's a bare minimum for what we can do to move forward. And we've supported that in the Dáil. We don't vote for it obviously here in London because we don't take our seats, but we have supported that in the Dáil in Dublin. And it is very much, we believe it is the least worst option, and it's the only realistic option at this point of moving forward without creating some sort of catastrophe.
There was a couple of bits there about the backstop I think I didn't know. So to be super basic, the backstop is the idea that when Britain leaves the EU, if we come up with a deal ultimately with the EU that doesn't guarantee a soft border in between Ireland and Northern Ireland, then Northern Ireland will have its own regulatory status, which will be closer to the EU than Britain.
EU customs union.
And that will be customs union and some sort of alignment with the single market.
Yeah.
But you're saying that won't guarantee people can move across
services
the border.
or people, no, it's just for goods. So for example, in the future trade negotiations, that again the Irish government will be arguing hard along the lines of single market and to what extent we can actually gain an awful lot of the protections there, and that's a huge battle. That is a huge battle. And again, the idea is that no matter what agreement we get on a lot of this stuff, it's going to be a regression from where we are now, and that's where the anger comes from. That's where the anxiety. If you take the Daisy Hill Hospital, a big hospital in my constituency, right on the border, you nearly have 20% of patients and staff who work in that are cross-border frontier workers. They have no idea at the minute about their social welfare packages, their pensions, everything else. It's completely up in the air, and what that's doing is it's creating a chill factor, and they are leaving. So we face severe shortages in employment in some of our areas already. I've mentioned haulage. A lot of the Eastern European drivers who might have been working in the north, for example, have already started to return home to places like Poland over the last number of years, and this exacerbates the problem for us.
Dan, you're very you work at New Left Review, very well networked in the British left. I want to know how you feel the British left has related to the politics of Ireland and Northern Ireland when it discusses Brexit, so especially proposals for Lexit. So there are many people we know who are sort of arguing for a sharp break with the European Union for various reasons, so that we can have more active government intervention, for example, and not be subject to state aid rules. I don't know if you feel like the impact that could have on Northern Ireland has informed debates on the British left to the extent that it should have done.
The short answer would be no. It hasn't. I would say in a general sense, beyond the issue of Brexit, the British left, much like wider British society in the last couple of decades, hasn't paid a whole lot of attention to what was going on in the north of Ireland compared with people from the generation of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where there was a real interest in Ireland. And of course, as you know, this has been one of the right-wing attack lines used against people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell for their historical relations with Sinn Fein going back to the 1980s. But from that point on, there was much less of an interest in what was happening there. And at one level I can understand it, because the peace process wasn't very exotic, wasn't very glamorous, and some people would say it was interminable. It had a real Groundhog Day quality, that there was another crisis, another collapse of the power sharing institutions, another threat to resign by David Trimble, another threat to resign by Peter Robinson rather. So the cycle went on, and even people whose job it was to analyse the politics of Northern Ireland, sometimes found their eyes glazing over.
Reminds me of Brexit.
Yeah, it definitely has that quality. If you imagine the Brexit process stretched out over 2 decades, without any more clarity, and with some even less agreeable personalities involved, so I can understand why people might have turned away from it. But it was an eye-opener for me when the last general election happened, and people woke up and saw that the Tories had lost their overall majority, and the DUP would now be the power brokers and the potential to keep Theresa May in government. I saw quite a few people, liberals and even socialists, saying, what is this party? Who are they? Look at these policies they have. Look at their homophobia. Look at their support for creationism. And I felt like saying, did you not notice this party was running one of the component parts of the United Kingdom for the last 10 years? I don't think you would have had that blind spot when it came to Scotland. The SNP had a similar policy agenda to the DUP. So there is a certain blindness there, but it reflects the wider culture. I mean, for example, very few people seem to know the positions that people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson took in relation to the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. For all the finger pointing at Jeremy Corbyn, and John McDonnell for the things that they said in the past. Michael Gove, for example, wrote a pamphlet denouncing the Good Friday Agreement. He said that it was a moral stain. And he was quite explicit in saying he didn't like this because of the precedent it would set for the rest of the UK. We concede the principle of minority rights in Northern Ireland. How can we deny that principle in the rest of the UK? If we concede that you should have a reform of the police force and make them accountable to a Human Rights Commission and so on, why wouldn't that apply in London? You know, I can imagine a lot of particularly black and Asian people in London would like the idea of a reformed police force that was accountable to a Human Rights Commission, but Gove found that to be very sinister. That was the line of the Daily Telegraph when Boris Johnson was writing for them. And that is the thinking that they've brought into the government. I mean, Gove still stands by that pamphlet that he wrote nearly 20 years ago. He doesn't argue so assertively against the Good Friday Agreement today, but I think it's fair to say that the spectrum of opinion in the current Tory cabinet ranges from indifference to the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement to outright opposition. They would have preferred the war to carry on. You know, that was quite clear. I mean, they claimed to believe that the IRA could have been defeated militarily in the 90s rather than having to negotiate a peace agreement with them. But that was really a fantasy. So they would have been quite happy to have another 2 decades of conflict and bloodshed rather than concede over what they consider to be fundamental British nationalist principles. So I think that should have received a lot more attention when people are drawing up the list of faults to find with the current Tory government, and there are plenty of faults to find, but as well as the harmful policies that they have for Britain, there's a specific malign agenda that people like Gove have in relation to Irish issues, and I think that should be highlighted a lot more.
I mean, that raises something interesting actually, because when people discuss the ERG, so the European Research Group, the Tory Brexiteers' relationship to Brexit, and they're wanting a hard Brexit, we sort of portray Northern Ireland as an irritation to them. So it's sort of this thing that's stopping them get what they really want, which is Britain to leave the EU. But do you think you could even be, I don't know, potentially conspiratorial about it, where you say one of the things motivating the ERG in their alliance with the DUP is to actively undermine the Good Friday Agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have been enough in itself to motivate them, but there's definitely an ideological convergence there. Also with the DUP, that the DUP opposed the agreement at the time, and then they shifted towards a position in their electoral competition with the Ulster Unionists, which were the larger party. They were the party that actually negotiated on behalf of unionism 20 years ago. They shifted towards a position of saying, we'll work within the structures of the agreement, but we'll be more hardline and we'll drive a harder bargain with Sinn Fein, and we won't be a pushover like David Trimble. So when the time eventually came and the DUP had overtaken Trimble's party and Ian Paisley was finally top dog within the unionist community, he was ready to sit down and do a deal with Sinn Fein, because that would mean he was the First Minister of Northern Ireland. But they never had a positive commitment to some of the more progressive reforms that were embedded within the Good Friday Agreement. They didn't like police reform, they didn't like human rights legislation. And the path that's been followed since 2007, because this is something I think that's important to stress, and this is where the general indifference to the outside world to what was going on in Northern Ireland is quite unfortunate, because when people saw the photographs of Ian Paisley shaking hands with Martin McGuinness, beaming smiles and the bonhomie and the camaraderie between them, the message went out to the international media: Northern Ireland is fixed, troubles are over, things are fine now, we can move on to other issues, let's talk about the Middle East, let's talk about something else. But really that was just the beginning of the difficulty in the north, because Ian Paisley, he hadn't prepared his own grassroots supporters and DUP activists for that deal with Sinn Fein. The Sinn Fein leadership were quite good at preparing their own base for the compromises and the policy shifts that were going to be part of the peace process. They did it gradually, step by step. They kept people on board. There were some splits and people breaking away, but in general they kept their base together. Whereas Paisley, right up until the moment when he actually broke bread with Sinn Fein and struck a deal, he was still coming out with this fire-breathing rhetoric that he would never do a deal with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. It would be like doing a deal with the devil. And if you read between the lines in his statements, you could see he was willing to do a deal if the price was right. But he hadn't prepared people, and so it was a bit of a shock. It was like getting the bends, really, when people saw these pictures from Stormont of McGuinness and Paisley together, and they refer to, I mean, for the international media, the New York Times or whoever it might be, it was wonderful to see these pictures of Paisley and McGuinness, but for people in the north, particularly hardline unionists, it didn't send out that message. They referred to them as the Chuckle Brothers, and it wasn't meant to be a complimentary nickname or a positive nickname. So Paisley was forced out of his position within about a year of that agreement being concluded with Sinn Fein by his deputy Peter Robinson, which was ironic because Robinson traditionally had the profile of being the more moderate and pragmatic figure within the DUP leadership. If you go back to the 1980s, already then the civil servants at the Northern Ireland office had picked out Robinson as the most pragmatic, the main unionist interlocutor for them, the man that they could do business with. But in the end, when Robinson finally eased Paisley into retirement and ascended to the leadership, it was by outflanking Paisley from the right and promising his party that he would take a harder line with Sinn Fein in the power-sharing government. So for the next few years, and then continuing after Robinson stepped down to be replaced by Arlene Foster, the DUP fought a war of attrition against quite small measures of reform. We're not talking about things that would fundamentally change the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. We're talking about same-sex marriage, a bill for the status of the Irish language, things that might appear symbolic, but symbolism matters in these kind of divided societies. And the DUP did everything it could to obstruct them, and the structures of the Good Friday Agreement allow them to do that because there's a requirement for cross-community consent, which allows the dominant party from either community to stop measures being pushed through at Stormont. So there was an increasing mood of frustration among Sinn Féin supporters and in the wider nationalist community. There was a head of steam building up there. Martin McGuinness made a particular effort to engage in outreach to the unionist community. You might have seen the pictures of him shaking hands with the Queen, attending war commemorations, things like that. His engagement with that seemed to be quite genuine and heartfelt. But again, the feeling among Sinn Féin supporters was that this wasn't being reciprocated by the DUP. He was reaching the hand out and it was being slapped back. So that was the sentiment before Brexit happened, And it's interesting that in the last year, Peter Robinson has come back from retirement and he's made a few high-profile speeches where he's been settling into the role of a wise elder statesman, encouraging moderation and good sense and telling the DUP that they should keep their eye on the bigger picture, preserving the union and not get so hung up on issues like the Irish language. He said at the DUP conference last year, I don't care about an Irish Language Act. I don't care about the Irish language. As long as it doesn't interfere with me, they can speak Irish until they're green, white and orange in the face. Which is a pretty sensible attitude from an enlightened self-interest perspective for the future of unionism. But it's surprising that he didn't have that attitude when he was the First Minister. It could have avoided a lot of trouble. So this was building up. There's also pressure on Sinn Féin over economic policies because when the Tory government comes in after 2010, deep cuts in public spending throughout the UK, which have a particular impact on Northern Ireland because the economy is so dependent on state spending. State spending accounts for nearly 2/3 of GDP, compared with about 1/3 in the south. It's the same profile that you see in many parts of Scotland and Wales and Northern England, where traditional industries have been allowed to die out. The manufacturing hubs in Belfast, the shipyards, construction firms and so on, they've been allowed to die out. The whole British economy has been run essentially geared towards London and South East, towards financial services rather than manufacturing. And the rest of the country, the rest of the UK, has been left to rot. And that affected Northern Ireland. So you had this to compound the problem of a lack of good private sector jobs. Now the Tories coming in, promising deep cuts in public spending. And it's combined with this idea that we need to rebalance the Northern Irish economy by reducing the size of the state, which is a bit like saying a man with one leg should rebalance his body by having the other leg amputated. It's not ideal to be so dependent on money coming in from Westminster, but it's better than not having that money at all. So the Tories imposed what was called welfare reform. It was actually welfare cuts, of course. Reform, in the sense they use it, always means something destructive and regressive. And Sinn Féin put up a struggle in the power sharing administration and in the negotiations against this, partly because they were making political gains in the south at the same time on an anti-austerity platform, positioning themselves to the left of the establishment parties, and it wouldn't really be consistent with this message for the southern electorate if Sinn Féin is also in a position of introducing welfare cuts and austerity in the north. But eventually, under pressure in 2015, Sinn Féin did sign up to what was called the Stormont House Agreement, which included commitments to reduce the size of the public sector, which effectively passed the buck for bringing in welfare cuts to Westminster, so that rather than the Northern Ireland Assembly and the power sharing government bringing them in, the legislation would be passed at Westminster. But it would affect people on the ground in Derry or Belfast or Newry just as much as if it was brought in by the local government. So again, there's pressure on Sinn Féin over that, and they were facing competition in the last Assembly election but one in 2016. They lost a couple of seats in Derry and in West Belfast, which would be strongholds of Sinn Féin traditionally, to a new left-wing party called the People Before Profit Alliance. So there's a combination of factors there. Pressure generated on the Sinn Féin leadership to shift away from their present course. And then Brexit comes along to compound this. Not quite the straw that breaks the camel's back, because the straw that actually broke the camel's back was this almost comical scandal involving the so-called Renewable Heating Initiative, which was, on paper, perfectly laudable idea to encourage the use of renewable energy in the north rather than fossil fuels, but someone neglected to include, in the small print, that you had to use renewable energy to replace an existing heat source rather than just using it for scratch. So there's all these stories about farmers claiming a grant because they're using renewable heating to heat a barn that was previously freezing cold and not used to store anything. Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, she was the minister who had been in charge of that scheme, and she was invited to step aside, at least temporarily, from her position as First Minister, so that there could be an investigation and perhaps return to her position afterwards. There was a precedent for that where Peter Robinson, her predecessor, he had stepped aside from his position while there was an inquiry into his business affairs. But Foster refused to do that. It was seen as a very arrogant position, and she presented it as if it would be appeasement of Sinn Féin to do this. So a crunch moment comes at the beginning of 2017 when there's a meeting of core Republican activists in the Felons Club in West Belfast, which is a private members bar, which, as the name would suggest, is for former IRA prisoners, and some of the people that the Republican leadership rely upon to keep them in touch with grassroots sentiment among their base said, we need to pull the plug on this, we need a change of direction. This coincided with the need for a leadership change for Sinn Féin in the North, because Martin McGuinness was terminally ill, and he handed over the reins to Michelle O'Neill from a younger generation. So Sinn Féin pulled out of the power sharing agreement, the institutions collapsed, there's a snap election, and in that election Sinn Féin did much better. There had been warning signs in the election the previous year, the loss of support to groups like the People Before Profit Alliance, but also there was a decline in the nationalist vote, which wasn't necessarily people going to other parties, or certainly not going to the Unionist parties. It was just nationalist voters staying at home. There was a mood of disillusionment with the peace process, apathy at best, if not hostility. Now, Sinn Féin went to the polls this time around with a new message, very different from the previous year, saying, in effect, we're seeking a mandate to put manners on the DUP. And their vote went up. They had a very good election performance. And they came within almost 1,000 votes of overtaking the DUP, which really would have been a seismic event, traumatic event for political unionism, to be overtaken by any nationalist party, let alone Sinn Féin. The DUP found itself with just one seat more than Sinn Féin. Also, for the first time, unionist parties in total no longer had a majority of seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The rest were composed either of nationalists or non-unionist, non-nationalist candidates. So that was the background leading towards the current crisis.
So that brings us up to date in terms of the politics of Stormont at the moment. So you have a particular arrangement in Stormont which is set out in the Good Friday Agreement, which means that you can only form an executive if the major Republican Party and the major Nationalist Party and the major Loyalist Party sort of agreed to form an executive together. That broke down 2 years ago. So Northern Ireland has been without a government for 2 years. As you explained it, sort of that played almost quite well for Sinn Féin electorally for a while, to sort of show that you were standing up to the DUP, who was sort of overstepping what was the understanding of how Northern Ireland would be governed. How much pressure are you under now? So I was listening to you on Any Questions on my way here, and you seem to be under a lot of pressure to go back into government, because this is obviously a region that hasn't had a government for 2 years. Can you talk me through a little bit about how Sinn Féin are strategising the next steps when it comes to reopening Stormont?
No problem. And I think to lead me into that, I think it's important, especially for a British-based audience, to maybe lay some of the explanation to where the British government has been at during the same process that Dan has just outlined, and I probably wouldn't find myself disagreeing with an awful lot of what was been saying. It's a fairly accurate picture of how things unravelled. There was a really important moment in the peace process in the early 1990s when the British government declared that they had no selfish or strategic interest in the north of Ireland. That laid the groundwork for the Republican movement to be able to say, now we can now go into this process. Dublin and Britain will be seen as impartial guarantors of the peace processes as such, and this will allow power sharing and peace to flourish in the north. Over the last approximately a decade, roughly since about 2010, that has started to unravel. So, for example, we've had the situation where a British government has been withholding and in breach of international obligations under human rights legislation, withholding money from legacy coronial inquests into conflict-related deaths. So, that's breaking international law. We've had a situation where a British government minister, the Secretary of State, has actually been on the streets of Belfast canvassing for the DUP during an election. Like, that's just phenomenal to think that would be allowed to happen. So we've had a number of examples, and now most recently we've had a British Prime Minister talk increasingly of her precious union and talk increasingly in those terms, and that's probably,
as they always say, we're the Conservative and Unionist party.
Yeah, and more or less playing on it big time. And at the meantime, we have a Dublin government who are very sensitive to any talk of Irish unity or anything like that. So again, and that goes hand in hand, I think, with the corruption of the Good Friday Agreement around the DUP, and I think that's been facilitated by a British government then, and again it shows that a departure perhaps from the New Labour era, that is, as Dan has rightly said, and Dublin did too as well. Peace is sorted in the north, took their eye off the ball and looked elsewhere as with the financial crisis and everything else. So that empowered and I think facilitated the DUP to do what they did to get that. But on the issue of if we come under pressure, make no bones about it, and we make no bones about it, we want to see the Stormont institutions back up and running. As an Irish Republican, I want to see Irish ministers taking control of Irish issues and being able to deliver for our people. However, we're under no pressure, none at all, to put it back up the way it was. Our campaign slogan from the time was no return to the status quo, and that's as much about our own approach to power sharing as it is generally. But that means very, very clearly that we will not allow a power sharing institution to be put back up that withholds rights from our LGBT community, withholds rights from our Irish speaking and other minorities, and that's a situation. How is it fair that someone from the LGBT community can get married in London or Cardiff or Edinburgh or Dublin, but they can't in Belfast? And what we've said to the DUP clearly is that time is over. We will not tolerate that any longer. And if you want to do good government, if you want to do power sharing, then you'll do it on the basis of parity of esteem and equality and integrity at the heart of government. And then also, as Dan has outlined, the serious allegations of corruption at the very heart of government, they have to be addressed, and the public inquiry will report this spring into that as well. But we continue to talk to the British and Irish governments about restoring devolution. Theresa May, even last week when we met her, when she came to Belfast, has absolutely no plan, no idea. Her Secretary of State is, to put it politely, woefully out of her depth.
That's Karen Bradley, isn't it? Who was shocked to find that people in Northern Ireland vote along sectarian lines as opposed to... Just
totally out of her depth, and has no plan, and she's disingenuous because every time she takes the airwaves she says my priority is to restore devolution, and she has no plan to do it. She has no intentions of doing it. She's in hock to the DUP for government support, and that's the situation we're at. I don't believe you will see any serious negotiations around restoring devolution until Brexit has been I don't want to say solved because we're a long way from that, but at least played out over the next number of months.
Does the DUP's relationship with the Conservatives and Brexit make a united Ireland more likely in the near future?
I think the short answer is yes. I think for a variety of reasons, I think we were heading that way anyway. Slower than what I would like as an Irish Republican, but I think for a number of reasons, demographics and anything else, I think that is a conversation that will grow legs and over time. But there's no doubt about it that Brexit in itself is certainly a catalyst. It's not the only reason. It's multi-causal, this, but it's certainly a catalyst for the speed at which we're having this conversation. And the DUP's intransigence and their ability to block what are quite reasonable and sensible proposals to move forward with the likes of the withdrawal agreement and the backstop. Their inability to deal with that, and bizarrely they have set themselves against every other political party, civic society, the business voice, the farmer's voice, and even if you take the farming voice, a voice that would have been so closely aligned with the DUP over the last 20 years, to hear them coming out and lambasting the DUP for their position in Brexit shows you just exactly where we are. And I'm probably testament to the change. And there's two things I would say here. In 2017, when I was elected to Westminster, that was the first time in the history of that constituency that they had elected an abstentionist Republican. Never before. In the entire nationalist representation at Westminster in 2017 became abstentionist. The SDLP lost their 3 seats. And to a large extent, and some of the commentary around this was that Northern nationalism had started to outgrow the Northern state for some of the reasons that's been outlined earlier. So, if over the previous decade, nationalism had become comfortable with the idea that we could be Irish, we could, display, we could be members of the GA, we could do different things we want to do and have an aspiration for unity somewhere down the line. Well, we can live with that. However, Brexit came along like a steam train throughout that and very much changed that. And I think we're starting to see now a realignment in political affairs in the island of Ireland. So we have the SDLP and Fianna Fáil have just ratified a new partnership arrangement which sees a new All-Ireland basis, and I believe long term that will be a full merger. And obviously there will be people from a Labour background within the SDLP who are not happy with that. They've already lost one of their most high profile speakers in that.
And that's because they're allying with a centre-right party, basically.
Centre-right, yeah. The shysters who were behind the financial crash in the south, and that's very much what people see. And the second thing, of course, is Fine Gael have now established branches in the north. So we're seeing a realignment of various political affairs. I think increasingly people in the north are looking to Dublin as their political centre of gravity and not to London.
Should Labour stand candidates in Northern Ireland? This was a discussion that started because of the SDLP allying with a centre-right party. What do you think?
I think Irish Labour should stand representatives across the island of Ireland. That would be my view on it. I think they're probably closer aligned to the dynamics at play. So I think, and again, it could quite possibly be something that is being looked at. I know it's been looked at by the Irish Labour Party, and you could see that move made in the months ahead.
How do you view Corbyn? Let's talk about that, because obviously he's been associated a lot with you, often as an attack line.
Not me personally, of course.
With Sinn Fein as I suppose with Jerry Adams a lot he's been associated with as sort of an attack line from the British press. I don't know if having I suppose this is the leader of a major party in Britain that's been the most friendly to Irish republicanism, I suppose, potentially ever? Is that the case?
Yes and no. Some Labour Secretary of States have been responsible for some of the worst excesses of British military engagement.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn,
Corbyn himself,
of course, as a leader of the opposition, is the most friendly politician to Irish republicanism that has had a major position in British politics, right? I'm not saying the Labour Party have been...
absolutely, yeah. No, and that could be a fair comment. I think probably where the real connection was made all those years ago via the likes of the Troops Out movement and obviously with the party is around the fact that Corbyn at heart, I think, is an anti-imperialist. I hope and think that still stands true to today. He strikes me as a man of great integrity. So I have no doubt that remains the case. I laugh when I hear the established media talk about his, the discussions or the talking to Sinn Fein in the day when British governments were engaged in talking to the Republican movement in those days too. So it's just rank hypocrisy from those people who should know better, and it's a smear campaign that, and I don't think it has any legs or works at all. But but at the end of the day, Jeremy at the minute, as we've seen through Brexit, is a leader of a British political party, very much looking after British political interests, and that's totally within his right to do, of course.
But as you were telling me earlier, the idea when a border poll happens, or if it happens, it's in the Good Friday Agreement that the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland gets to decide or gets to make the judgment that it seems likely that a majority of the Northern Irish population might want a united Ireland. So if Jeremy Corbyn is the next Prime Minister, that becomes quite likely. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah. Well, this is something that Peter Robinson specifically highlighted in the speeches that I was talking about last year, where he was warning Unionists to prepare for the possibility of a united Ireland and not just to dismiss it as something that couldn't happen. He said it was within the gift of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to determine whether there should be a border poll. He didn't expect that to happen, certainly not when there was a Tory government reliant on DUP votes, or even when there was a majority Tory government. But he said a Labour government headed by Jeremy Corbyn would call it without hesitation. And it was something that Robinson bitterly reproached David Trimble, who was the Unionist leader who actually negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, that he allowed this clause to be inserted. Because back then, people didn't really think about it very much. You know, Sinn Fein, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, they had already lowered their sights. Traditionally, the position of the Republican movement was to say Britain should announce a date for withdrawal. There won't be an IRA ceasefire until Britain has announced a date for withdrawal by a set timetable. By the time of the Good Friday Agreement, they had moved away from that position, and their hope was that you would get, alongside the institutions set up for Northern Ireland, you'd also have cross-border institutions covering the whole island, bringing together the two governments, and that they would have fairly substantial powers, and there would be a dynamic there where those powers could be expanded, and you would get incremental progress towards a united Ireland by that route. Now, that didn't happen in the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, because David Trimble was a lawyer. He came from a background as an academic at Queen's University, so he was good at whittling down the wording of all the clauses relating to cross-border institutions, so that in effect the bodies that were set up, the North-South Ministerial Council, were tightly ring-fenced, and there was very little potential for them to expand. Almost as a consolation prize for nationalists, this clause about a border poll was included, which nobody really expected to happen in any foreseeable future.
Because they assumed Republicans would always be a minority of the Northern Irish population.
And possibly because of that, it was vaguely worded. So it just says that if the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has reason to believe that there might be a vote in favour of leaving the UK and joining up with the rest of Ireland, he or she should call a border poll. But there's no mechanism for how the Secretary of State should establish that. Obviously, the only way to be absolutely sure is to call a referendum, so it's a circular argument in a way. But it very much depends on who is in power at Westminster, you know, and what feelings they get from the ground. So in many ways, you know, Brexit has turned out to be an unexpected windfall for Sinn Fein and for all proponents of Irish unity, because in the years leading up to Brexit, the referendum in 2016, the idea of United Ireland in some ways seemed more elusive than ever, because there had been polls. Now, polls on the question of Irish unity, they give different answers. It very much depends on the way the question is worded, and that's still the case today. Since 2016, you can find polls showing strong support for Irish unity or very low support, depends how the question is worded, and various other aspects like that. But there were a number of polls showing support from Catholics for United Ireland was quite low. And that was a real blow to Sinn Fein, because they had set quite a bit of store by the idea of demographic change, that there were going to be more cultural Catholics than cultural Protestants over time in the north. And, you know, and there has been, you know, a convergence there, where at the time Northern Ireland was established nearly 100 years ago, it was about a 2/3 to 1/3 balance. Now it's more like 55 to 45. But there's no guarantee that people who are cultural Catholics in their background are going to support a united Ireland in any circumstances. And, you know, in the period going back 5 or 6 years, people were sceptical. I think particularly sceptical about the idea of joining up with the South because of the economic crisis. It looked like it was in bad shape. It was dependent on a bailout from the Troika, and with all the austerity programmes and cuts that went with that. So there wasn't a particular hunger on the part of even people who consider themselves nationalists for Irish unity. Now, Brexit has changed that dynamic. And it's ironic in a way that Sinn Féin now has positioned itself as the leading opponent of Brexit in that context, because traditionally Sinn Féin were the most critical of the EU among Irish nationalist parties on either side of the border. Going back to the 1980s, their policy was to be in favour of withdrawal from the EU, full stop. And then they shifted towards a position of what they called critical engagement. So very much like the parties that they sit with in the European Parliament, from the United Left group, the post-communist radical left parties, critical of the Maastricht Treaty, the European Central Bank, the Eurozone. And particularly since 2008, they put forward, very sensible criticisms of the way the EU and the Commission and the ECB were handling the Eurozone crisis, and they supported the position of the Syriza government in the first half of 2015 in their confrontation with the EU. They opposed the Troika programmes in the south of Ireland outright, and that was the basis for much of their electoral success. So having been, and I know from the context of British politics that people often lump together different forms of criticism and different forms of scepticism towards the EU. You presumably saw the clip being shared the other day of Jeremy Corbyn denouncing EU, IMF austerity programmes imposed on Greece and Portugal and Ireland, and people like Michael Crick saying, "Oh, how could he possibly have voted Remain if he said these things?" It's not the same thing. So I don't want to suggest that Sinn Féin's traditional criticism of the EU is the same as Tory criticism or DUP criticism, but certainly they have traditionally adopted a pretty sceptical, critical attitude towards the EU, and there's been a pivot since 2016 towards a much more positive view, in a way that's quite similar to the SNP in Scotland. If you remember, the SNP in 2014, they were going against the EU by promoting Scottish independence. They were risking Scotland's membership of the EU. Now they've positioned themselves as the most ardent anti-Brexit force. There is an element of this within the broad Irish nationalist camp, and this isn't just something that refers to Sinn Féin, but the Irish government, where Leo Varadkar, although Fine Gael, the ruling party in the south, is traditionally the most anti-Republican party, but they've adopted a more green nationalist rhetoric directed towards the Tory government, directed towards Brexit. But there's been a lot of talk about how the EU is supporting the Irish government position, and the EU is standing up for the rights of small nations, as if it wasn't just a few years since the same EU was trampling over small nations, including Ireland, including Greece, including Portugal, at the behest of more powerful states. So that's something that's important to stress, that to the extent that the EU has been supporting the Irish government position, and larger countries like France and Germany have been supporting the Irish government position, it's because it's in their interest to do so. There's an alignment of interests there. It's nothing to do with altruism on their part.
All right, final question from me, and then I'm going to get some from the audience. It seems to me as if the harder the Brexit, the more likely the United Ireland. So is there a sense in the back of your mind, or sort of like motivating Sinn Féin? I'm not saying I can see this in any of your actions, but is there a sense in which the hardest of Brexits, even though you oppose it, would benefit your ultimate goal, which is for United Ireland?
I can see why you would say that. However, we have to live in Ireland. We have to live in the economic wasteland that would become and raise our families, and you would be forced back to a situation similar to the 1950s in Ireland, probably, where immigration would have a huge effect on society, and trying to build any new Ireland out of that would become, an amazing achievement that would be very, very difficult. So no, we're absolutely committed to trying to avoid that if at all possible. We believe that the route to Irish unity is there for us, and we know what we need to do to follow that, and and even stuff around Europe. But yeah, look, and I would take that on board. Like, we still, I think, probably because a lot of our media and our voices around Brexit are louder now, that at the minute you maybe don't hear it quite so often. Our criticisms of the European direction around opposing the likes of the army, swallowing up this expansion programme, even the recent policy decision to recognise the Venezuela coup, for example. We're still saying that. We still have the criticisms of Europe. We will still be very critical of Europe. We want to see absolutely a social union of peoples in Europe. We don't believe in a lot of the things the European Union are doing. But when it comes to Brexit and the repartitioning of Ireland, European interests at this moment align with Irish interests.
So you're not like hard Brexit accelerationists, which
No.
would be that position, wouldn't
No.
it? All right, give me your questions in the comments. While you're doing that, as you know, Novara Media is only possible because of your kind support. So thank you to all of you who donate a monthly amount at support.novaramedia.com. If you don't, please consider. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock. As ever, please like this video. Please share this video, because we want more people to see it. I'm going to have a look through questions. I remembered one from before that I quite liked. Are there any left-wing unionists in Northern Ireland?
Yes, they are. Few and far between, perhaps, but there definitely are. There's no doubt about it. I know an awful lot of people who consider them part of the Labour tradition. Maybe not a lot of the people who, for example, are part of the Labour Party, who are memberships in the North, would very much consider themselves constitutional unionists, but very much would see themselves as progressive, as left wing, if you want to put it like that. I'm trying to think of a DUP or Ulster Unionist Assembly member or MP.
Well, would they, if you were a left-wing unionist, would you still join the DUP or the UUP? Or is there a different party?
Well, I think you
I
struggle.
suppose you could ask the same thing if you're a hard right Republican.
I think you struggle to join the DUP. I think that is a contradiction in terms. However, I think the broad-based and traditional background of the Ulster Unionists has seen some. I do remember one Ulster Unionist MLA quoting James Connolly in the chamber. In the old Stormont, he's no longer an MLA, Michael Copeland, who would have been very much part of that inner city Belfast tradition, and there's always been that tradition in and around the inner city, especially with Belfast. And I think back to the 1949 election, that there was a great opportunity, I think, to build on what was happening and going forward. But however, political unionism tends to beat what we term is the big drum, and to bring people back into line.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends whether you're talking about unionism with a capital U or a lowercase u, you know, because there's unionism as an ethno-national community, and then there's unionism as a political force where, you know, traditionally there have been left parties in Northern Ireland that supported the union. There was the Northern Ireland Labour Party that at various times got a fairly substantial vote. There was the Communist Party, which was never a big electoral force in the north, but which had quite a lot of influence in the trade unions.
And was that unionist?
It had a pro-union position. You know, they had an aspiration towards United Ireland in the long run, but in the short term, they supported Northern Ireland's position in the union, and most of their members came from a Protestant background. So it's perfectly possible for people from that kind of Protestant unionist background to have a left-wing socialist or social democratic outlook. But within political unionism, the main attempt to set up a party like that came from the loyalist paramilitaries, ironically, because in many ways they were the most sectarian elements within unionism. But there was an attempt by the political wing of the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, which called itself the Progressive Unionist Party, which identified as a socialist party. Now, what they meant by socialism would have been the traditional politics of the British Labour Party. It wouldn't have been revolutionary Marxism or anything like that, but within the culture of unionism, that was quite a step forward. They had a pro-choice position when Sinn Fein didn't, I should say. And people like David Irvine put forward what seemed like a fairly attractive message. This is at the time when the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated. There was a lot of hope that they were going to become a more forceful voice within unionism. You know, during the talks process, the parties aligned with the loyalist paramilitaries were actually much more accommodating, much more willing to compromise as long as the union was safe than the mainstream unionist parties, the Ulster Unionists and the DUP. Unfortunately, that project, the loyalist political project, has failed. The UDA's political wing was disbanded a long time ago. The PUP is still there, but it's regressed politically. It's now fishing in the same waters as the DUP. I think it was dragged down above all by its connections with the loyalist paramilitaries, because whereas Sinn Fein was able to negotiate, you know, the transition from being in the shadow of the IRA to being on an equal footing to the IRA, to the IRA then being stood down and gradually fading into the background, whereas the loyalist paramilitaries never stood down after 1998, and they're still there, they're still active. They're actually more of an immediate menace to people in their own community than they are to Catholics very often, and they're involved in all kinds of racketeering. There's plenty of loyalist paramilitaries who weren't even born when the UVF and the UDA notionally called a ceasefire, but they're still involved in drug dealing and so on. And the burden of being associated with them really dragged down the PUP by association. You know, they had one member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and she resigned from the party in protest at the continued activity by the UVF. So unfortunately that's dragged it down, and that's also a factor for why you know, a left-wing force that accepts the union, I wouldn't call it left-wing unionists as such, but you know, a left-wing labour force that accepts the constitutional status quo, why it's difficult for them to organise in working class Protestant communities, because on the one hand the loyalist paramilitaries, because of their degeneration into gangsterism, they're not able to offer a positive political project for their own communities, but they don't want anyone else coming in there either. And this was the experience of, there is a small group of labour activists, self-described labour activists, that includes a councillor called Mark Langhammer, represents a largely Protestant working class area in Belfast. His car was blown up on orders from the local UDA commander, simply as a warning, know your place, we're the guys who call the shots around here, quite literally. So, these are the difficulties. It's not that, working class Protestants or the Protestant community in general are inherently reactionary. There's particular conditions that make it difficult.
And Mark's actually a good example. Mark would be a leading educationalist and trade unionist within the education sector, and he would have shared platforms with Sinn Fein members and others who were arguing for the abolition of the 11 plus, and this was an opportunity, I suppose, on a cross community, cross working class basis to develop something that would have benefited working class kids right across. And yet political unionism smashed that from above. You had a party like the DUP, who has strong roots in a working class background, actually supporting the sustainability of grammar schools going forward. And again, it was simply because this was seen as a Sinn Fein policy. So Mark actually is a fair comment. And there's a number of councillors, even on the John Kyle, for example, on the Belfast City Council, and Julianne Core. There's different people there, definitely, with those very much their politics rooted in working class solidarity. But I think any time they really come to show that or demonstrate that, the big weight of the political parties bears down on them greatly.
Sorry, when I'm looking like this, that's because I'm looking at questions, not because I've got bored by your answer. This is from, I think, a very public socialist who's Phil BC on Twitter. Very good blog, you should check it out. Could Dan and Chris say something on change within unionist communities, like the Tories are toxic to younger people here? Are we finding that the DUP are becoming estranged from younger unionist voters in Northern Ireland? So the idea that young voters are turning away from conservative forces here, is there a sort of groundswell of young people who are unionists but don't want to be voting for a party that seems fairly right-wing?
Yeah, well, a lot of it's anecdotal. Going back to one of the previous Assembly elections, a leading member of the DUP, Nelson McCausland, lost his seat in North Belfast. And again, some of the commentary around that was to do with his very outspoken and very right-wing fundamentalist views. I know Owen Jones once says that the DUP were the political wing of the 17th century, and Nelson would very much be the vanguard of that view. So I have no doubt, and you hear it, and the Pride Festival in Belfast is quickly becoming the biggest and best day in Belfast, and the energy around that and the young people that is bringing a toll, I think, on the DUP, even around the debate around abortion and the big demand now to have modern healthcare in the north. You are hearing more and more voices from that community start to speak out. Now, will we see that in electoral terms? We have to wait and see. But certainly anecdotally, that you think that would be the case. I'm going to ask a really basic question. Why are the DUP so conservative in terms of, say, issues like gay rights and abortion? Because I mean, from the most naive view, when people think of why did the Republic of Ireland take so long to legalise abortion, you think of Catholicism. What is it about the DUP that...
Well, it goes down to the origins of the party, that it was closely linked to... Ian Paisley had his own church called the Free Presbyterian Church, which was a hardline Protestant fundamentalist sect. He broke away from the mainstream Presbyterian Church because there was some very, mild ecumenical initiatives involving Anglicans and Catholics. That was what he was known for in the 1960s before he came to the fore as a political leader, for denouncing ecumenical politics, for denouncing integrated education and that sort of thing. Paisley was a religious leader as well as a political leader. He had a doctorate in theology from Bob Jones University in the US, which was a bastion of segregationism and white supremacy. He knew his Bible inside out, and the whole way through his political career, while he was intervening on the political stage, he was also maintaining, a steady stream of theological publications. If you look them up on Amazon, you can see them. They have some great names like Sermons with Startling Titles. And so Paisley, he brought that to his political party, and many of the core cadre of the DUP were either members of the Free Presbyterian Church or members of other hardline Protestant churches like Peter Robinson. So that became a real challenge for the DUP after 2007. It was one of the factors leading to Paisley's forced early resignation, because they had no choice but to, in their capacity as government ministers, make grants available for LGBT groups and so on. There was no legislative way out for that, but the grassroots, the Free Presbyterian Church, weren't willing to accommodate that, and Paisley was unceremoniously removed from his position as the head of the Free Presbyterian Church at the same time as he was being eased out of the leadership of the DUP. So there really is that element. Traditionally, the DUP, before its rise after 1998, it was the smaller of the main unionist parties. Its vote fluctuated, but it was generally much smaller than the Ulster Unionist Party. The Ulster Unionists represented a broader spectrum of unionist opinion. You had quite conservative elements there, you had liberal unionists, you had people who considered themselves Labour unionists, and they generally had a more secular outlook. The DUP was a more religious outlook, but they then ended up being the representative after 1998 of the majority of the unionist population as they are today, but their core cadre still has that very conservative orientation, which is a bit of a liability, a bit of a burden for them now, because this is one of the points that Peter Robinson was making, his change of heart around an Irish Language Act. It's not because he's suddenly become a more tolerant, outward-looking person. It's because he realises the union genuinely is in danger, maybe not today, but at some point in the future. So we shouldn't get hung up on the question of an Irish Language Act. Equally, it's not good tactics for unionism to have the defence of the union linked to opposition to abortion rights or opposition to gay marriage. Those are measures that are perfectly compatible with Northern Ireland still being part of the UK. But if you do link the unionist cause to those quite reactionary issues, then that has the potential to alienate a lot of younger people, particularly because the traditional unionist line against unity with the rest of Ireland was that it would mean coming under the domination of the Catholic Church, and for a long time that wasn't an unfounded argument, because the Catholic Church was very strong in the south, and any time there was a major political intervention by the Catholic bishops in southern politics, that was great propaganda fodder for the Unionists. You would hear it from every platform of the Unionist Party and the Orange Order. Look what happened in Dublin when people tried to stand up to those barbaric Catholic bishops. And this continued right up to the 1980s, when the war was being waged furiously in the north at the same time. There were two referendums in that decade. One was to bring in a constitutional ban on abortion. The other was an attempt to overturn the constitutional ban on divorce, which the then Taoiseach, Garret Fitzgerald, said this was part of a constitutional crusade to make the South more open, more progressive and more inclusive, and make it easier for Protestants to come into United Ireland. That was voted down. And both of those referendums, particularly the one on abortion, were really bitter and rancorous, and anyone who went through that experience on the left, liberal, pro-choice side, still bears the scars of going through that. So now you look at the vista from the south, it's very different. The position of the Catholic Church, certainly its position in terms of popular opinion, I think has taken a terminal blow. It still has a lot of residual institutional power, still controls a lot of schools, still controls a lot of hospitals, and it would require a very determined government to root them out of that. But in terms of having a firm grip on people's minds, that day is done. And we saw that first in the referendum on gay marriage, and then even more dramatically last year in the referendum on abortion. So it's very hard for the DUP to make a case to younger, more liberal-minded Protestants in the north that a united Ireland would mean you would be subject to Catholic domination. And it's even harder for them to make that case because the DUP hates the fact that the South is moving in a more liberal direction on questions like gay rights and abortion, and they're still holding out against the extension of the British abortion legislation to Northern Ireland. It's one of these legal quirks that, although Northern Ireland's part of the UK, the Act in the 60s that legalised abortion for England and Scotland and Wales has never applied to Northern Ireland. It's one of the few issues where you would get a consensus between the Catholic bishops and the Orange Order that we need to keep British abortion out of our country, which just meant that women had to do the same thing that they did in Ireland. They had to get the boat to Britain and go through all the expense and all the trauma of that.
The other small thing, and where maybe it takes this theme out of the situation in the north, certainly is there is a brain drain to a certain extent among that community as well. An awful lot of what you might term progressive, liberal, left-wing unionists tend to go to university, come across to Britain, and actually stay and don't return to the north. And it's an interesting facet of the entire dynamic. Whereas an awful lot now of the young people coming through from maybe the nationalist background are being educated in Dublin or Belfast, and they're staying and they're starting to enter the trades and the professions that they maybe never had access to before. So you're starting to see in a higher level of the judiciary here now you never would have seen before. For example, there was a recent conference in Belfast that was very much looking at Irish unity and Brexit, and you had a former head of the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, talking very profoundly about, I will not need to ask permission to advocate for Irish unity. This is an amazing sight to see, a former head of school of law at Queen's University saying something like that publicly. It shows you how things are changing societally in the north.
I think that's probably a good place to end. Thank you both for joining me. I've learnt a lot. I hope the audience have as well. Great questions as ever. Next week on Tuesday, I'm going to be away, but Ash Sarkar will be taking over Tisky Sour for that week, so you'll be in very safe hands. So I'll see you in 2 weeks, but tune back in this time next week for a show hosted by Ash Sarkar. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
This was Tisky Sour. We are Navarra Media. Good night.